We need to move. That storm is closing in fast.
Are you sure we should go that way?
The very first words out of her mouth were, "This is HOA property now." That's what she shouted at me the second I opened the door to my own mountain cabin, the place I had scraped together every last dollar to buy, only to find her standing in the kitchen, ironing like she owned the place. Her groceries filled the fridge, her family portraits sat on the mantel, and she even flashed a badge around like she was some sort of official authority. The way she stared me down, I honestly felt like I was the one intruding. So tell me, would you have lost it right then and there, or tried to keep your cool? Drop a comment and let me know what you would have done. The drive up the mountain had already tested my patience, taking nearly 2 hours longer than I remembered. Every twist and turn reminded me why I had jumped at this house from just a set of photos. The price had been right because of the isolation. But when I pulled up with my toolbox and plans for renovations, the last thing I expected was the sound of someone moving around inside. For a second, keys in hand, I wondered if I'd made a mistake, maybe mixed up the address. But no, it was the same house I had seen in the listing. Same weathered porch, same sweeping mountain view. Except now there was a strange car in the driveway and curtains in the windows that had been bare for half a year. When I knocked, a woman opened the door like she belonged there more than I did. Mid-50s, apron tied over her jeans, a dish towel in hand, as if I'd interrupted her doing her normal household chores, except this was supposed to be my house. And before I could even say a word, she lifted her phone and announced, "Yes, this is HOA security. I have a trespasser inside the dwelling." That's when I pulled out my own phone and hit record. Something about how confidently she delivered those words felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for this very moment. My eyes landed on the mantel, framed photos of children I didn't recognize, where my renovation plans should have been. She motioned to a stack of official-looking papers on the counter, right beside a neatly arranged coffee station with her favorite mug. "This property is under emergency oversight due to abandonment after the previous owners passed away," she explained, shuffling through the paperwork with practiced ease. "The HOA has authority to maintain vacant homes during fire season. I'm Melleen Pierce, chair of the Design Review Board and Fire Safety Liaison. Your purchase doesn't automatically cancel our oversight, I'll admit," she sounded convincing, "but I had my own paperwork, closing documents, title transfer, insurance policies. Everything legal and recorded with the county. I bought this place 6 months ago," I said, holding up the proof. She barely looked at it before replying, "That's fine." But the property was already under HOA interim control when you closed. Since the former owners died without arranging a transition, we filed abandonment status. Our emergency authority takes priority over private ownership when safety is at stake. The way she said it made me question myself, like I really was trespassing in my own cabin. Meanwhile, she had been living here rent-free under some so-called emergency provision that sounded more suspicious by the second. I started filming every room. Her clothes filled the closet, her food stocked the refrigerator, and her mail sat on the counter, addressed to Ms. Pierce, Fire Safety Liaison, at my home address. She had turned my retreat into her residence and somehow made it sound official. Digging under the kitchen counter, I found a folder labeled Property Protection Files. Inside was the very abandonment report she had mentioned, conveniently dated just 1 day after my closing. Odd, considering this was an HOA that usually took weeks just to approve a fence color. The interim authorization claimed the property was still abandoned, even though I had legally purchased it. That's when a car door slammed outside. I looked through the window and saw a sheriff's deputy approaching. Apparently someone had called in a suspicious person. Funny thing was, I wasn't sure whether they meant me or her. Deputy Maria Santos introduced herself and asked for ID from both of us. Melleen quickly flashed her HOA credentials and launched into her story. I handed over my license and purchase documents. Explaining this was my legal residence. After reviewing everything, the deputy gave her verdict. "This looks like a civil dispute over property authority, not a criminal trespass. Since the complainant is claiming HOA oversight, you'll need to resolve this in court." Not long after the deputy left, my phone buzzed with a text from the building department. "Your permit application has been frozen pending resolution of the oversight claim and fire safety assessment. Construction cannot proceed until further notice." I stared at the screen in disbelief, realizing that the $15,000 I'd already put down in non-refundable contractor deposits was as good as gone. Loan payments were starting next week, with or without renovations. Every day of delay was money burning away. That evening, I turned to the only neighbor who lived close enough to know the truth, Harold Brennan. He was out watering his garden when I approached, and after hearing me out, he invited me inside. His home felt like stepping back decades, but his mind was sharp. I spread my paperwork across his coffee table while he slipped on his reading glasses. Harold had been an accountant before retiring, so he knew his way around documents, but before diving in, he paused and said he'd seen something strange at another vacant house nearby, one the HOA had also claimed. "Your purchase timeline is straightforward," he said, tapping the highlighted dates. "Escrow closed March 15th, title transferred the same day. But here's what doesn't sit right with me about this abandonment claim. I've lived here over 2 decades, and I've never seen them move this quickly on anything. That's what raised my suspicions. I asked Harold to walk me through how abandoned properties were normally handled. He explained that the HOA should have made genuine attempts to contact the new owners before granting any caretaker allowances. There should have been signed authorizations, recorded expenses, and multiple budget entries discussed at board meetings. Harold pulled a thick binder from his desk. "This is every HOA record from the last 2 years. If they'd tried reaching out to you about abandonment procedures, it would be in here. We combed through every meeting minute and notification. Not a single mention of my property or any attempt to contact me." Then Harold pointed out something striking. The minutes from March 16th, just 1 day after my closing, showed a motion had passed approving caretaker subsidies for the supposedly vacant mountain property following the Hendersons' deaths. It also stated no financial oversight was necessary due to the extended vacancy period. Another property down the road was cited as precedent, showing this wasn't an isolated case. In other words, the board had authorized payments without even verifying whether the property had been sold. That meant Malene had secured her allowance the very day after I legally became the owner, effectively blocking me from taking possession of my own cabin. Harold leaned back, his face clouded with concern. "The Hendersons were a kind, elderly couple," he said quietly. "No relatives, kept to themselves. When they passed, the place sat empty for almost 2 years. But here's the part you won't like. Malene's been living there nearly that whole time. She started as a volunteer caretaker after they died, then the HOA formalized it, granting her a monthly subsidy. She even convinced the board to pay her $800 a month as if it were rent for occupying a house she didn't own. For nearly 2 years, that's over $19,000 she's collected. And now you're paying the mortgage, insurance, and taxes on a property you can't even set foot in because of her false claim." Harold laid out the timeline. The Hendersons died in early 2023. Soon after, Malene moved in under the guise of volunteer maintenance. By the end of that year, her position was officially recognized with compensation. I purchased the cabin in March 2025, yet the HOA never stopped the payments. For the last 6 months, even with my name on the title, she's continued receiving money to live in my retreat." He shook his head. "This is the same setup they used on another vacant property. Malene's turned it into a system." He explained that, in another case, an elderly couple passed away, their house sat empty, and someone moved in as a caretaker. That property never sold, so he hadn't thought much of it, but it was the exact same arrangement. A year of allowances had been paid out on that one, too. The pattern was clear. This wasn't just Malene overstepping. In my case, she may have built a scheme designed to profit off homes left vulnerable, first when their elderly owners died, now when absentee buyers purchased them, sight unseen. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Harold walked me to the door. "I've got copies of all the HOA documents if you need them for legal action," he said. "What she's done to you isn't right, and I'll testify to the discrepancies." I couldn't shake the feeling I'd stumbled onto something much larger than my own property dispute. If other houses were involved, if multiple caretakers were being paid to live in homes they didn't own, this could be organized, not accidental. My phone buzzed. "A message from the contractor. Deposit deadline tomorrow. If site clearance isn't resolved by Friday, we'll push to next month." That meant more fees and another round of loan payments without progress. Standing in Harold's driveway, staring at the cabin that legally belonged to me but functionally belonged to someone else. I realized this was no longer just about my investment. Harold had already mentioned that other house with the same story: elderly owners gone, caretaker moved in, HOA subsidies flowing. The next morning, I stepped into the county office. The place smelled like coffee and stale paperwork. Inspector Williams sat behind the desk, gray hair, weary eyes, the demeanor of a man who'd seen every kind of property fight. I spread out the documentation Harold and I had compiled, hoping to unfreeze my permit before the contractor's deadline hit. Williams methodically laid out the papers across his desk as I explained the situation. He nodded occasionally, though his face betrayed nothing. Then Meline walked in. Instead of her usual casual clothes, she wore a sharp business suit and carried a sleek tablet that made my thick stack of paper look ancient. She introduced herself with her full arsenal of HOA titles: Chair of Design Review, Fire Safety Liaison, Regulatory Documentation Liaison. With practiced confidence, she placed the tablet on the desk and launched a video reel of supposed violations. "As you'll see in our records," she said smoothly, "this property has been under HOA procedural oversight since the prior owner's deaths. A legal purchase doesn't automatically cancel administrative authority when ongoing hazards require continued supervision." Inspector Williams flipped through her neatly organized binder: stamped forms, photos of alleged issues, correspondence with county agencies. She'd come fully prepared, and her preparation was undeniably thorough. I countered with my own proof: purchase contract, closing documents, title insurance, property tax receipts, everything showing I was the rightful owner. Exactly what any property holder should present during an inspection. Williams studied both sets of documents while Meline and I sat in tense silence. Finally, he looked up with a weary expression. "This isn't a standard permit problem," he said. "HOA interim authority can apply to truly abandoned properties, especially in fire-prone regions. But typically, a legitimate purchase ends abandonment status, unless ongoing risks justify continued control. The real question is whether this property still qualifies as unresolved despite the transfer of ownership." That's when Meline revealed her trump card. She flipped open her binder, revealing photographs and detailed reports. "As you can see, the property has several safety risks that warrant ongoing oversight. Structural weaknesses, fire hazards, electrical issues, all of these were present before the sale." I glanced at the picture she was showing the inspector: evidence of neglected upkeep around the house. Loose railings, worn outlets, vegetation creeping dangerously close to buildings. Typical problems you'd expect from an aging mountain property. Yet her confidence unsettled me. She was too prepared, too certain these flaws would strengthen her case, almost as if she already knew exactly what the inspector would find. Inspector Williams shut both binders and announced his ruling. "Based on the documentation, the purchase is valid, but it's unclear whether emergency HOA authority is still justified. A site inspection will determine if hazardous conditions require continued oversight." Meline smiled like she'd just claimed victory. Leaning close, she whispered that once the inspector toured the property, I'd appear careless compared to her. Then, louder, she declared that the entire community's safety depended on proper upkeep of mountain homes. The inspector scheduled the visit for the following morning. Both parties were required to attend with any witnesses or additional evidence. He emphasized that his decision would be final on both permit approval and supervisory authority. As we left, Meline radiated confidence. In the parking lot, she turned to me with a look that might have been genuine sympathy. "I know this is frustrating, but mountain homes require expertise you might not have." My phone rang as I pulled into Harold's driveway. It was my contractor. Bad news. If we couldn't start tomorrow, the work would be pushed 3 weeks. The crew was booked solid, and the equipment rental expired that night. That evening, Harold and I mapped out a strategy for the inspection. He agreed to act as a witness since he'd observed the property for years. But he worried about something Meline had said: her certainty about what the inspector would uncover. It wasn't just confidence. It felt like she had inside knowledge. Suddenly, her composure during the meeting made sense. She wasn't relying on chance. She was banking on influence. By late afternoon, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows when I arrived at my cabin, hoping for a straightforward talk. To my surprise, Meline was there, preparing a home-cooked meal. The scene might have felt ordinary anywhere else, but this was my kitchen. She looked up from chopping vegetables, smiling as though she were just a neighbor dropping by. "I thought we should talk before tomorrow's inspection," she said. "I want you to see my perspective." She set down the knife, wiped her hands, and shifted from friendly cook to official representative. "I appreciate that you're working with the HOA process instead of fighting it. Too many owners ignore their community responsibilities." She launched into what sounded rehearsed. Guidelines about mountain maintenance, fire safety rules, and the need for experienced oversight during ownership changes. Then she held up her HOA badge toward my phone's camera, almost daring me to record her. I asked her to define qualified owner. She paused, carefully choosing her words. "Someone who understands the unique demands of mountain living, fire safety, wildlife management, vegetation clearance, skills you gain from years of living here, not from renovation manuals." Her meaning was clear. She didn't see me as qualified to own the cabin because I was new. By her logic, she had more right to live in my retreat than I did, even though I had purchased it. I decided to press the financial side. "Harold mentioned you've been receiving $800 per month from the HOA for nearly 2 years as part of this caretaker arrangement." Her expression tightened. "Maintaining an empty mountain property is a full-time job," she admitted. The HOA paid her monthly, smirking. Unaware my phone was live-streaming everything to Harold and half the neighborhood chat, I asked to see the utility bills and receipts she'd claimed. If she was reimbursed for expenses, there should be proof. Malene hesitated, then deflected. "The HOA handles the funds elsewhere. My role is oversight, not bookkeeping," she snapped, flashing her badge again to block my camera. Translation: she didn't want me to see where the money was going. That raised the question, was the $800 reimbursement for real costs or just rent-free living with a paycheck? I shifted tactics. "Let's assume your caretaker role was valid when the cabin sat empty. I bought it legally 6 months ago. When does your temporary authority end? That's what tomorrow's inspection will decide. If the property meets hazard standards and you show you can maintain it, the HOA may consider transferring control back to the owner. Consider. Not guarantee, just consider." She made my legal ownership sound like a privilege she could grant or withhold. I looked around the kitchen she'd claimed as her own. Her coffee maker on the counter, her groceries in the fridge, her mail stacked neatly by the phone. She had built an entire domestic life inside my cabin, while I kept paying the mortgage, taxes, and insurance. I couldn't deny the house looked immaculate, clean, warm, well-kept. She had taken real care of the place when it might have fallen into neglect. That's when she delivered the line that stung the most. "I kept your retreat safe when you bought it, and vanished for 6 months. Maybe you should be thanking me instead of trying to evict the person who protected your investment." And she wasn't wrong. Her stewardship had likely prevented deterioration. But she'd also been living rent-free while drawing steady pay. Whatever her motives, she'd profited plenty by occupying my property without permission. I asked her straight out how much she'd been paid in total disbursements. She rose and started cleaning up the dinner prep, making it clear our talk was finished. Tomorrow's inspection would decide whether interim control would stay in place or be returned to the owner. Walking back to my car, I had the uneasy sense that she'd won this exchange. Her points weren't completely without merit, and her concern for the place was real, yet she was living in my retreat, drawing regular stipends and acting as if my ownership rights was something she could authorize. The moral tangle of the situation was driving me mad. She really had looked after my asset while I was away, but she'd also entrenched herself as the permanent occupant of a property I'd legally bought. Maybe you should be thanking me. The morning air was sharp when Inspector Williams arrived at my property. Harold was already on site, having offered to witness the official review. Malene showed up with a thick binder, a camera, and extra documents she'd prepared overnight. Inspector Williams started his inspection in an orderly way, beginning with exterior structural elements, foundation, deck supports, railings, stairs. I followed, taking my own photos while Harold watched. Malene stationed herself so she could record the inspector's findings. The first thing she flagged was a stretch of deck railing that felt loose when grabbed. "See how this wobbles?" she announced loudly, not only to the inspector but toward Harold's phone camera that was live-streaming to the neighborhood chat. Inspector Williams tested the railing and made notes. The movement was noticeable, but something about it struck me as off. I looked closer at the connection points. The bolts fastening the railing to the posts were finger-tight, as if they'd been loosened recently. I pointed this out to the inspector. "These bolts should be fully tightened with a wrench." It looks like someone loosened them just enough to cause movement. The inspector inspected the joints and agreed that proper tightening would remove the hazard. Malene swiftly moved on to her next claim. She said the electrical outlets showed aging and possible fire danger. She produced photos of outlets with scorch marks and loose cover plates that supposedly posed immediate risks. But when Inspector Williams checked the actual outlets, they were what you'd expect in a house this age. Clean, properly installed, no visible damage. Comparing his assessment to her photos, I noticed her images depicted far worse conditions than what was present. Inspector Williams asked Malene when those images had been taken. She faltered, then said they documented conditions over several months. Yet the timestamps on her camera showed they'd all been taken within the last week, some as recently as yesterday. That pattern repeated through the inspection. Each alleged hazard either looked exaggerated in her visuals or had been staged freshly. Fixtures shown loose that should have been tight. Debris mysteriously piled in corners right before the visit. Harold caught my eye and nodded toward guttering that looked damaged in her pictures, but appeared intact in person. On closer inspection, we found fresh tool marks suggesting someone had purposely loosened the mounting brackets. The inspector was recording everything, but I could see his expression shifting. He raised his voice, and Harold's live stream picked it up. This property appears to be in excellent condition overall. Nothing here matches the alarming visuals presented. Then Inspector Williams made a discovery that altered everything. While checking the kitchen, he found a small notebook tucked behind cleaning supplies. Inside were handwritten lists of property alterations with dates and specific instructions for creating hazard evidence. The entries read like a manual for manufacturing interim control proof: loosen railing bolts just enough to create movement, remove outlet cover plates and photograph them. Pile brush near foundation before photographing fire hazards. Each item was precisely planned. Inspector Williams held the notebook up and asked Malene to explain. Her face drained of color when she saw what he'd found. Those are just maintenance notes about issues I discovered during routine inspections, she said. But the dates told another story. Most entries were from the past 2 weeks, lining up with my permit application and today's inspection. She hadn't been finding hazard issues over months of interim control. She'd manufactured them to justify continued authority. The inspector's conclusion was crushing. This property shows no conditions requiring interim control or ongoing HOA supervision. The submitted visuals documenting hazards indicate unauthorized modification of property conditions to support false claims. Harold stepped forward with his witness statement. I've observed this property regularly over the past 6 months. The conditions shown in her photos never existed during normal periods. These danger claims appear to have been created specifically for this inspection. Inspector Williams delivered his ruling. Building permits are immediately restored for this property. All HOA interim control authority is terminated effective today. Property owner has full rights to proceed with planned renovation activities. As the inspector packed his gear, Malene made one last frantic plea. Even if current conditions don't require supervision, this property owner's irresponsible absence could create future hazards. But Inspector Williams had seen enough. The evidence pointed to the deliberate fabrication of hazard claims rather than legitimate protective actions. This constitutes potential fraud regarding official county procedures, he said. My contractor was standing by, equipment loaded and ready to go. After months of holdups, my renovation could finally begin. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that someone who'd gone this far wouldn't simply give up. People who fabricate evidence and document their schemes don't usually stop after a single failure. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak made me wonder whether someone was tampering with my property again. After finding that notebook full of sabotage plans, it hit me that Malene had been preparing for weeks. Folks who plan with that level of detail rarely walk away after one setback. By 11 p.m., I decided to drive up and check the house. Harold had volunteered to help keep watch, and his porch light was on when I arrived. He came out wearing a jacket over his pajamas and carrying a flashlight. Couldn't sleep either. Been thinking about that notebook the inspector found. Someone who documents their fraud that thoroughly isn't going to walk away quietly. We opted to check the dwelling together. From the road, the house seemed normal, but as we closed in, something felt off. Then we heard sounds from the rear. Careful, deliberate noises like someone using tools in the dark. Harold and I crept around the side to investigate. What we found made my stomach drop. Malene was crouched beside the platform support posts with a cordless drill and what looked like a small saw. Harold gripped my arm and whispered, "She's not staging things for photos this time. She's actually cutting through the platform supports themselves. If someone steps there tomorrow, that whole section could collapse." I pulled out my phone, started recording, and dialed 911. The dispatcher asked about the emergency, and I explained that someone was vandalizing my home and creating structural damage that could cause severe injury. Malene must have heard me because the drilling stopped suddenly. We watched her gather her tools and attempt to leave through the back, but Harold knew the terrain. "There's only one way out through those trees. She'll have to come back this way." When she stepped out of the shadows, she looked genuinely surprised to see us there. Her earlier confidence had completely vanished, replaced with the frantic look of someone caught red-handed in wrongdoing. I kept filming, asking her to explain what she was doing to my platform supports. She insisted she was checking for safety hazards the inspector might have overlooked, but the evidence around us made that impossible to believe. Fresh wood shavings, half-cut beams. Deputy Santos arrived within 15 minutes. This time there was no question about what was happening. She inspected the supports with her flashlight, documenting everything on her body cam while Harold continued live streaming from his phone. What we were looking at was intentional property destruction and reckless endangerment. If anyone had stepped onto that platform after those cuts, it could have collapsed, causing serious injuries or worse. This went far beyond a property dispute. Malene made one last desperate attempt to explain, claiming she was identifying new hazards after the inspection and that my negligence forced her to act immediately to protect the community. But the physical evidence told the truth, fresh saw marks that had weakened the structure to the point of failure. This wasn't hazard documentation. It was deliberate sabotage intended to trigger a collapse. Deputy Santos arrested her on the spot for criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. As she read out the Miranda rights, I stood on what was left of my platform, staring at the damage someone had tried to inflict on the property I had legally purchased. Harold examined the cut beams with his flashlight. If contractors had shown up the next morning without us discovering this, someone could have been seriously injured in a collapse. She had been willing to create real danger just to legitimize her claims. It hit me then. This had escalated from fraud into potentially lethal sabotage. She wasn't just trying to milk steady stipends anymore. She was prepared to cause structural failures that could harm or kill people just to maintain control. As the sheriff's car drove away with Malene in custody, I felt both relief and outrage. Relief that the immediate danger was gone, and outrage that she had taken her scheme to the level of endangering lives. Harold and I spent the next hour carefully documenting the damage for legal and insurance purposes. The platform would need a full rebuild, along with inspections of other areas where she might have tampered with the structure. By 2 a.m., I was standing in my driveway, looking at the house I had finally reclaimed after months of court battles. The thought hit me hard. How close I'd come to losing everything. Not just financially, but possibly someone's safety. Tomorrow I'd call my insurance, my contractor, and likely an attorney. Tonight I just wanted to make sure the place was secure. Catching her in the act had prevented potentially deadly sabotage. 3 weeks later, I was in the courthouse hallway, waiting for Malene's sentencing. The criminal case had moved faster than expected, probably because the evidence was so undeniable. Fraud, property damage, and reckless endangerment made it a straightforward prosecution. Harold sat beside me, reviewing his witness statement. The prosecutor had called him to testify about the HOA timeline inconsistencies and the fabricated evidence scheme. With his accounting background, he was the perfect person to explain the financial side. When Malene was brought in, she looked nothing like the self-assured HOA officer who once confronted me in my own kitchen. An orange jumpsuit replaced her business attire, handcuffs replaced her credentials, and her face was now displayed on the local news. The prosecutor laid out the charges one by one. Criminal fraud tied to county procedures, unlawful occupancy of private property, property destruction with intent to endanger, and theft of HOA funds through false claims. Each carried jail time and repayment. Her lawyer argued she acted out of genuine concern for the neighborhood and not personal gain, that she truly believed the home was unsafe and that her methods, though misguided, were meant to protect the community. But the evidence destroyed that argument. The notebook with sabotage plans, the fabricated hazard reports, the timeline showing she moved in immediately after my purchase. This wasn't protection. It was organized fraud. The judge reviewed all of it before delivering the verdict. She had abused legitimate HOA authority to take over property she didn't own, and her escalation into physical sabotage was a direct threat to public safety. The sentence was clear: 18 months in county jail, followed by 2 years probation. Full repayment of all losses tied to the renovation delays, including mortgage payments, rescheduling contractors, legal fees, and repair costs. She was also ordered to return more than $19,000 in caretaker stipends she had wrongfully collected. The court issued a permanent restraining order banning her from any involvement with my properties. The HOA didn't walk away unscathed either. The judge ordered a complete audit of their stipend program, her removal from all positions, and public release of the results. Any similar schemes would now fall under county oversight. After the hearing, Harold and I grabbed coffee downtown. The legal win was satisfying, but what mattered more was that my property was finally secure. Building permits were active, renovations back on track, and Harold had agreed to act as on-site manager, checking progress daily. That gave me peace of mind while I handled other matters in town. The contractors began with repairing the platform damage she'd caused. Surprisingly, the rest of the home had been well maintained. The house itself was in excellent condition. My insurance company covered the sabotage repairs immediately. The criminal conviction made it obvious the damage was deliberate, not normal wear and tear. They processed the claim quickly. 3 months after sentencing, I drove up to check progress. The transformation was incredible. Brand new deck with reinforced supports, updated electrical wiring, a modern kitchen, fresh paint everywhere. It finally looked like the mountain retreat I had imagined. Harold met me on the porch with a progress update and a small celebration. "Final inspection is next week," he said. "After that, it's officially yours." We sat on the new deck, watching the sun set behind the mountains, talking about the future of the home. I decided to start it as a vacation rental, with Harold managing bookings and upkeep. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her sabotage had ended up funding my renovation. The restitution covered expenses I would have had to pay, and the delays actually gave me time to hire better contractors. That evening, we walked through the finished house. Every room restored, every system working. The cabin was completely mine. I stood in the same kitchen where she once pretended to hold authority, now free of her name in any official record. 6 months of lies and sabotage had ended with a clear ruling. Fraud exposed, ownership secured, and closure achieved. Buying a home should have been simple, but truth takes time. Authority can be faked, but it never lasts. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts and stay alert.